Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our Grad Prof Dev webinar, Creating an Online Research Presence, with Stacy Winchester, who is a Research Data Librarian in the University of South Carolina University Libraries. We're pleased to be able to bring this content to you virtually, especially in the midst of the current COVID-19 public health pandemic. I'm Heather Brandt. I'm Associate Dean in the Graduate School and Professor of Health Promotion, Education, and Behavior in the Arnold School of Public Health, and I'll be moderating our webinar today. And before I turn things over to Stacy, I want to make sure that I orient you to a few of the features of the GoToWebinar platform. So you should have a webinar menu or toolbars that are available to you. Currently, we will be taking questions using the questions ribbon on the webinar toolbar. Just select that and enter your questions. You can enter your questions as you are thinking of them. I will do my best to monitor those. However, our plan is to take questions at the end. You also can use the chat function. So if there are times where we have discussion opportunities during the presentation, please use the chat function to enter in your answers or responses. You also can use the question toolbar for that as well. For today, we have only one handout available under the handouts ribbon, and we will be adding a PDF of the slides from today's webinar. Those are going to be sent out by email to everyone who is registered. And if you're watching the recorded version of this webinar, please email gradprofdev@sc.edu to get a copy of today's a PDF of today's webinar slides. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over. I'm going to turn off my webcam and turn things over to Stacy. This is a great presentation. I really have enjoyed it. I've heard it several times, given to different audiences, and each time I take away something different. In fact, now more than ever, your presence online is going to be very important to building your reputation as a scholar and also for your future career pathways. So keep that in mind as you listen today and engage with our presenter, Stacy Winchester. Stacy, take it away.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and thanks everybody for joining today. So we have a couple of, not problems, but maybe, minor technical challenges. So Dr. Brandt's gonna forward the slides for me today, and I was going to show you guys a couple of live demonstrations of how to do some things, and that's not gonna work out. So as I go through, I'll let you know where I would have done this, and I'll be sending out a bunch of links for more helpful information after today's presentation, and I will send directions on how you can do what I was going to tell you how to do. Okay, so yeah, again, my name is Stacy Winchester. I'm a Research Data Librarian at University Libraries, and my job is helping researchers, that's students and faculty, preserve, share, and find data for research. And today I'm here to talk to you about creating an online research presence. We're going to think about, the online presence that you already have and how you can manage it to meet goals that you might want to set for yourself. Next slide, please. Thank you. All right. So as new academics, you guys might wish to consider curating your online research presence to increase possibilities for collaboration in the future and to impress, possible employers. So, you already have an online presence, and I do too. I know I've Googled myself. You've probably Googled yourself, and when you do that, you see a little breadcrumb trail of the scholarly work that you've done so far. So I'm here to talk to you today because if you wish to actively contribute to that online presence, you can set yourself apart as a strong voice within your profession, within your discipline, and you can kind of tell the story of what people are going to find when they look for you online. You can make sure that that you're somebody who's really out there and who has a presence, a strong scholarly presence that will be impressive to other people. So if you want to do that, one of the first questions you might want to ask yourself is what your goals are. So, for example, do you want your personal, because we all have a social media presence already, most of us probably do, and you already have some kind of scholarly online presence if you've done any kind of scholarly work. And, do you want them to exist separately? Do you want them to overlap? There's no right or wrong answer here. It's whatever you're comfortable with. And another important question is how much time you want to dedicate to curating that online research presence, because you can take a lot of time doing this. It can take up a great amount of your energy, but it also doesn't have to. It's kind of up to you. Next slide, please. So today we're going to think about basic steps to developing that research presence. As Dr. Brandt said, it's probably more important now than ever that you are visible to your peers and to potential collaborators and employers online. So first of all, you can think about how you're going to prepare before you ever publish. We'll go through some different considerations and ideas that you can put into practice if you wish to. What factors do you want to consider in the publication stage for all of this scholarly work? And then secondly, published, you'll need to think about how you're going to preserve your work and how you're going to share it, how you're going to promote it to others. And of course, there are a lot of different ways to do that. And finally, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how you can monitor your research impact, that research presence that you have, to determine whether your work is performing well, whether it's impactful. This will be particularly important to some of you who go on to work in academia, and whether you're reaching an appropriate audience. Next slide. So we'll start out by thinking about some pre-publication considerations. And one of the things you will want to think about is where you want to publish, what journals you wish to attempt to publish in. When we're starting out, we get pretty excited to get something published at all, and certainly should be. But there are also, it's a two-way street. They're not just choosing you, you're choosing them as well when you publish in a journal. So some things you can think about. Where will the article be indexed so that others can find and use their research? So when you think about the way that you interact with scholarly literature, with articles, you can think about what databases will this article be indexed in? How easy will it be for others to find my work? How relevant is the journal to my research area? Is it a good fit for my topic? It's obviously a very important one. How prestigious is the journal? Does it have a good reputation? What are the acceptance rates? Will the journal allow you to freely share your article with others? We'll talk a little bit about this again in a little bit, but it's important particularly as you're building an online presence for yourself. If you want to share your work with your research community or with the general public, it's important that they are actually able to see your work, to get into it and read it in its entirety. So that's not always possible, but we'll talk about some ways that we can do our best. And then how do you even find out the answers to these questions? And that's kind of a lot. Even that right there is a lot. And the good news is that university libraries can provide access to a lot of the resources that can help you answer these questions. If you move on to another university, the library there will also be able to answer your questions. So you're always going to have, for journal publication questions, there's always a good resource in your librarians. We're happy to receive questions about these kinds of things. and we can definitely help. So we have a few databases that you can use to find out some of the answers to these. So for example, down at the bottom, there's a little gray box that says resources, and then it's got links to several databases that the library subscribes to help you with these pre-publication considerations. And I was going to show you one of them, and instead, we're just going to talk about it, and then afterward, I'll send you a little bit more information on it. But the first one that is listed here is Cabell's Scholarly Analytics. And you can use that database to find acceptance rates, manuscript guidelines, and peer review process information for journals. So that's a good place to go if you're interested, say, well, I'm interested in this journal, but what are their acceptance rates? How likely am I to be accepted if I submit an article here? There's Ulrich's Web, which provides publication, subscription, and indexing data on hundreds of thousands of regularly published and irregularly published serials. And then there's Journal Citation Reports, which is the one that I was going to show you right now. And it's a database where you can go to find information about journal impact. So by now you are likely aware that different journals within your field have a different reputation. Some are going to be more prestigious than others. And it behooves you to know within your field which ones are the important journals. And Journal Citation Reports is a really great place to go to find that information. You can rank, for example, all of the journals, not really all of the journals, all of your journals that are indexed in that database, which is a huge number. You can rank all of the journals by impact, so you can find out which journals in your very specific subfield are more prestigious and which ones are lower down on the list. You can look up impact factor for specific journals. And just in case you're kind of wondering what I mean when I say impact factor, that's the average number of times that articles from a journal were published in the previous 2 years that have been cited during that year. So impact factor is a measure of impact for journals, not for people. And a little bit later, we'll talk about some impact measures for people, because both of those are kind of important. Let's do next slide. So we're here today to talk about your intellectual property, right? When you write a journal article, that is your intellectual property and you own the copyright to it. So although it's not maybe as exciting as some of the other interesting things we'll talk about today, I do need to talk to you a little bit about copyright, because there's no way for me to talk to you about sharing your work or promoting your work unless you have a little bit of an understanding about your copyright to your work. So copyright protects creative expressions that have been put in a fixed tangible medium. So what I mean is you write an article, a poem, you paint a picture, you write a song, and you actually write it down. You might, write it, draw it, type it, record it. Once you have put your creative work in a fixed tangible medium, you own the copyright to that work. You don't have to apply for copyright. It's automatically yours. So copyright lasts, generally speaking, the life of the author plus 70 years. It can be a little bit different depending on the specifics for joint works, like for example, an article probably going to have more than one author. For joint works, it's 70 years, again, after the death of the author. For works for hire or anonymous works, it's 95 years from publication. So there can be some different rules. But what I want you to know is that copyright is actually not one thing. It's a bundle of rights. And that bundle of rights includes the right to make copies, distribute your work, prepare derivative works, publicly perform or display the work. So if it's, a dramatic work, or if it's a piece of music, for example, or you can license any of the above to a third party. And you can exclusively give away any of those rights, or you can also non-exclusively license any of those rights so that you're not giving away, you're sharing them. And this is important. So we can do the next slide. Because there's some things you might want to do with your research. This is all leading somewhere, I promise. So for example, you might want to be able to share your research with your colleagues and other stakeholders. You might want to be able to put a copy of your paper in a repository, a discipline repository or an institutional repository. You might want to be able to post your paper that you're getting published on your website. You might want to be able to use charts and graphs or images. You might want to be able to reuse part of the article that you're publishing in your dissertation for your thesis. And you might need to share your finished publication to fulfill a funder requirement, or you might want to share it because it's great to share research widely when possible. Okay, next slide. And the reason that I tell you this is because traditionally, when you publish a journal article, the publisher might take most or all of your copyright from you, and that might be fine. Maybe you're publishing in a prestigious journal and you don't care. I would be in the same boat. If a prestigious journal wanted to publish my article, I would probably be okay with giving away my copyright to it. But know that they don't need your copyright, right? So in order for a publisher to publish your work, when you think about that earlier bundle of rights that I mentioned, they need a couple of them. They need to be able to make copies, obviously, and they need to be able to distribute your work. But traditionally, they take some or all of them away from you. And the reason that I mention this is because when you publish, you're going to sign a contract with your publisher. And that contract is going to tell you what you're allowed to do with your work after you publish. So you need to read that contract, and you need to be able to understand it. It's going to be written in language that you can understand. It's usually not really legalese. It's something that I can understand when I read it, so I know that you can as well. Need to understand it, because if you want to share it, you need to not break copyright. So luckily, there are ways. Let's say that you want to do one of those things that we mentioned on the previous slide. You know, you want to like share copies of it with your colleagues. You want to post your publication in the institutional repository, and you find when you read through your copyright agreement that you can no longer do that. You can attempt to negotiate to keep some of those rights. So there are a couple of ways to do it, but it kind of starts with just contacting your publisher and telling them what you're hoping to do. There's a really easy way to do this. It's called a SPARC addendum. That's S-P-A-R-C, and I will send a link to a SPARC addendum so you can see what I'm talking about after our presentation today. But that's a form that you can fill out and send to the publisher when you're in the process of publishing, to tell them that you think you need to retain some of your copyright that you would otherwise be losing when you publish with them. And they might say, oh, okay. And they might say, nope, sorry. But what they won't say is, oh, you're asking to keep this. Never mind. We don't want to publish your article anymore. You don't really have to worry about that. So if it's important to you, you can try negotiating your rights. It might not be, but no matter what your situation is, read your contract when you publish so that you know what your rights are and that you don't, accidentally break the law. Next slide, please. And to follow up on that, I'd like to talk just briefly about open access, because of course, if you publish open access, you'll retain all the copyright to your work. I think by now, most people kind of have an understanding of what open access is. In case you don't, open access means that your work upon publication is freely available for others to read and do what they need to with it, which is great. It's great for just society in general, right? Because they might learn something that can really help others when they read your article. if you had published it in a non-open access forum, they might not have been able to access it. It's nice for you because it makes your work more accessible, and which it might lead to higher citation rates. If you publish open access, also, you're going to retain the copyright to your work. So you don't have to worry about losing your ability to share the final PDF through Facebook or Twitter, or posting that PDF on your blog, for example. Next slide.
Stacy, before we go to the next slide, we do have a question that I think is timely for this section. So the question is, why wouldn't we have to worry about a publisher pulling a contract? What protections are guaranteed for authors?
So I don't know that there are any, but it's fairly common for people to attempt to negotiate these rights. If you're uncomfortable with the idea, certainly, don't feel free not to follow through on it, but it is very common. Spark is that Spark addendum that I mentioned, is a very widely used tool for negotiating author rights. And so publishers are used to seeing it. I don't know if you ask, what are the rights of potential authors? I don't know that there are any. So again, if that kind of feels like it's going too far to your comfort level, don't attempt it. If it's important to you though, you can always reach out and just ask about it. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of ways to publish open access. We don't have to go too much into this. There's a couple different kinds of open access, and certainly you don't need to remember the terminology here, but I want you to understand what open access means. And again, the reason this is important is because if you're trying to promote your work, if it's open access, then your potential readers, your potential audience can very easily access it. So I want you to know what your options are. So the first option, the one that says gold open access, is kind of the one that most of us are used to seeing when we think about open access. And that's where we publish in a journal, and as soon as we publish, it's immediately available for anyone to read. Great, that's wonderful. So let's think about the way that publishers traditionally make money. So traditionally, a library or an agency or an individual pays for a subscription to a journal, right? And that's how they pay their bills. A lot of academic publishers, make kind of a ridiculous amount of money, and that's a whole different conversation, but it does cost money to run a journal. So traditionally, they charge money. If they're publishing open access, there is no subscription, right? Because it's all automatically available to anyone. So one of the things that makes it difficult to publish open access is that there are often fees involved with publication that are passed on to the authors or the funding agency or the institution or the library, and they're called APCs, article processing charges. It can cost a few $1,000s to publish open access. There are many really great open access journals, and then there are also a bunch of really awful ones, and that also is a conversation for another day. But do know that even really good open access journals, they're also often charging APCs because that's how they make the money to run the journal. So one little tool, a bit of help for you while you're at the University of South Carolina, is that if you want to publish gold open access and you are facing an article processing charge, the university libraries has a fund that can pay those charges for you. So this is for graduate students and faculty and other folks at the university. There's a little link down at the bottom of the slide. you don't really need to worry about copying that down. First of all, the slides will go out, then I'll also send a bunch of links out, and I'll make sure that I send this one out as well. It's a link to learn more about this fund and to apply for the funds if needed. I think you can get this award once per year. It's a really good deal, if you want to publish open access. And then there's another kind of open access. It's green open access. And again, you don't need to worry about the terminology, but this is when somebody publishes some version of their work in a repository. So it could be like Scholar Commons, which is the institutional repository at USC, or it could be some disciplinary repository. Oftentimes people don't retain the copyright to share their final publisher's formatted version of their article. So a lot of times these are preprints, and a lot of us have probably heard of preprint repositories, and maybe depending on our discipline might even use them. So for example, computer science or math, astronomy, you might be using arXiv, a preprint repository. There are many of them, but that's just another way to publish open access. You're not using an open access journal per se, but you're still making a copy of your work freely available. Next slide. So we'll shift gears just a bit and talk just a tiny bit more about some pre-publication concepts that you might want to think about. And of course, when you're publishing, you're already thinking a lot about your title and your abstract. I don't need to tell you that those are important, but I am going to mention that there is some research out there that shows that shorter titles receive more citations. And I'll send that link out so that you can look at that article for yourself. So titles are important, your title of your work. I often find myself looking at lists of journal articles where the titles are so similar that I really can't differentiate one from another. I'm sure you found yourself in the same situation. Just something to keep in mind, if there's a way to make your title of your article a little bit unique, great. Abstract, again, you're already thinking about this if you're attempting to publish a journal article, and certainly if you're attempting to publish your, when you read through the author information for your publisher, they'll tell you what kind of abstract they're expecting from you. But we can think of an abstract kind of like a teaser. It's obviously it's going to be accurate, it's going to be interesting, it's going to be informative. We want it to leave your reader wanting to actually open the article and read it. So just another reminder that this is something to pay close attention to. But the one here that really strikes me as important is keywords. So here's the thing. Sometimes when you publish an article, you will be asked to provide author-supplied keywords. These are actually really important. If you are asked to do this, you'll probably be given a maximum number, maybe not, but usually you'll be given a maximum number that you can provide. Carefully consider the keywords that you're choosing and make them really useful. And that's because these keywords are some of the metadata that your potential readers will be using to find your article, right? So they might be different than the ones that the publisher or the database where ultimately your article will be discoverable. It might be different than those. So think very carefully about those keywords because they can really help connect you to your audience. Next slide. And just a little bit more. One thing to consider when you are publishing is how you want your name to appear. I say this as a librarian who's been a librarian for a very long time. Authors over their career sometimes change the way that their name appears. So it might be last name, comma, first name, last name, comma, first initial. As much as possible, it might not always be possible, but as much as possible, try to be consistent with the way you have your name appear, because it's going to make it easier to track all of your citations over time, and it's going to make it easier for other people who are looking for your work to find all of your work. And another thing that you can do is sign up for ORCID, an ORCID ID. So ORCID is a way to create a unique identifier for yourself. So it's a little bit, you guys probably know what digital object identifiers are for articles. They're a number that's permanently associated with that article. Well, an ORCID ID is an number that's permanently associated with you. So it helps people identify and discover your research, and it helps eliminate name ambiguity. So if you are a researcher who has found that there are several other researchers with very, very similar names or the same name as you, this is a way to eliminate the name ambiguity problem and to encourage proper citations. So ORCID, if you go to orcid.org, it's free, you set it up, it takes about a minute. That's just one more way to help yourself out a little bit before you publish. And if you are a student who thinks you might be applying for NIH or NSF funds in the future, they're going to start requiring an ORCID ID. So might as well go ahead now and get ahead of the curve and get that set up. Next slide. Okay, so great, you've published and this is wonderful. Now you've got a publication out there and you start to want to think about different ways that you can promote your work. There are a lot of them and you won't want to do all of them because, as we mentioned earlier, it can be quite a time suck, as it is, even if you're just doing the minimum. So there are a lot of different platforms that you can use. For example, there are repositories. We mentioned that a couple of times. Could be institutional repository or some other kind of disciplinary repository. You might want to use popular social media like Facebook or Twitter, or academic social networking like ResearchGate. Some people write press releases, particularly if they think that their research might be of interest to the media, for example. People share their slides. Sometimes they share their research data, particularly if it's required by their funder. And a lot of researchers have a personal website, a research website or blog, where they let people know what they're working on. Next slide, please. Here we have a paywall. Again, we're trying to share our research as much as possible and promote ourselves as researchers. So the goal is to try to make some version of your work available that your audience has access to. It could be the final version, could be preprint or postprint, but it's good if there's some version they can access, because if you send out a tweet about your article and it's got a DOI and then they hit that paywall, then it's a little bit frustrating. You can't always do it, but it's worth trying. So some publishers, they do realize that this is not good, and they also realize that it is in their best interest to allow you to be able to share your work, because if they show that they are publishing this important work, that can't be anything but good to them. So some publishers provide a way to share a read-only version of an article through social media. And an example of that is Springer Nature has an option called Shared It. You can go and get a Shared It URL. You can tweet that out or whatever, and then your reader will be able to read, but not easily print and not easily download a copy of your paper. So that's really cool. And does the publisher that you're interested in have that? I don't know. I'm not sure how widely this kind of thing is caught on among disciplines, but it's worth checking out. It might be an option. Next slide, please. And again, we mentioned repositories. There are lots of kinds. There's the Scholar Commons, there are subject repositories, general repositories, there are data repositories. I think that's all I'll say about that. So we can scoot on to the next slide. Okay, so now let's talk about, I think, what is probably some of the most interesting content, and that's, actually promoting your works that you've published through social media. As I've mentioned, you don't want to try to do all of this because it can take a lot of time, but think about the different platforms that are available and think about which ones you think could be most impactful for you. When you start this process, one thing you might want to do is consider spending a little time writing concise explanations of your research in plain language. So if you're sharing on Facebook or Twitter, you're sharing your research outside of your normal realm where everybody's a professional in your discipline. If you're writing a press release, the press needs to be able to understand what your research is. If you're making a YouTube video, same thing. So it's good to learn to write about your research in plain language, which can be a little bit difficult. So for example, if you're trying to reach, elementary school teachers or the media or policymakers or other kinds of practitioners, what is the language that would be impactful to them? So the first platform that we've got here is Facebook, and I think most of us probably already have a personal Facebook account. You can also create a separate author page specifically to promote your research. So if you have a neat book cover or some kind of image from a journal article that you published, and you could use that as a cover photo, or you can make sure you have copyright permission to do so, of course, or you could use your headshot. You can send your author page out to friends, professors, and other people, ask them to like the page and ask them to share it as well, and then slowly build a following. So I think that one of the keys to using this platform effectively, or any of the platforms that we're going to talk about effectively, is continued use. So it's kind of a disappointment if you go to someone's author page or artist page, for example, and you find that they have not published or not shared anything on that page, rather, within the last couple of years. Like, oh, well, they're not really invested in this page. Okay, and then you move on. So if you decide to take this first step and start attempting to promote your own work through social media, keep in mind that it's something that you're going to have to keep up with in order for it to be effective. The next on the list is Twitter, and about 1/3 of researchers are active on Twitter. It's an easy way to reach a wide audience. You can easily share a DOI in a tweet. Twitter forces you to keep your summaries brief, so again, that's another way to get a little bit of practice with writing short, easily understandable summaries of your research. And a good way to recruit a following for your research on Twitter is to locate those hashtags that are common in your area of expertise and tag your posts with those hashtags. You can engage with your audience and ask and answer questions. Don't forget to tag people who might be interested in your work, like peers, potential funders, potential collaborators, the media, if that's something that you're interested in. And then more connections can be made by live tweeting at conferences. You may have already taken part in this. I know I've been seeing it for the past several years, where the conference provides a conference hashtag, and then they ask you to tweet out while you're in your presentation. And that's a great thing to do, because it might allow you to connect with other attendees at the conference who you wouldn't otherwise have had the opportunity to engage with. It's good to be responsive, keep things simple and fun, and of course be very, very respectful, because you're not only tweeting about your peers, like you're tweeting about your peer that's right there in the room with you. Don't say anything on Twitter that you wouldn't want to say to their face, of course. And then there are websites and blogs. A lot of researchers have found that personal websites and blogs are a great way to promote their research. It's a good way to open up a conversation about your research, again, in kind of plain language for others. Some common platforms are WordPress and Tumblr and Blogger. And I think while you wouldn't want to do all of these platforms, it's probably useful to do more than one of them. So, for example, if you make a blog entry on your blog, don't just leave it floating out there in cyberspace. Instead, also share it through Facebook, share that blog entry through Twitter, same thing for YouTube video. Let one mode of social media kind of back up the other to increase your ability to impact and share with others. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about academic social networking. I've got 3 different sites up here. ResearchGate and Academia.edu are definitely social networking. LinkedIn, a little bit different, but I'm lumping it in with this group for today because LinkedIn is also kind of different from regular social networking. So ResearchGate and Academia.edu are social networking sites, and they're designed to connect researchers with common interests and encourage sharing of works. So here's what they're good for. You can upload your journal article to ResearchGate, and you can make it available for others to get, and that's very nice. But here's what they are not. These academic networking sites are not repositories for your work. They do not have long-term preservation policies like a reputable scholarly repository would. And so what that means is that you don't want to rely on ResearchGate or Academia.edu as a place to keep your work long-term. There is no reason, these are companies, and there's no reason to assume, that they will always be around. You definitely do not want to rely on either of these sites as a place to fulfill a funder mandate to share your work. So if your grant funder says you have to make your article available, that's not what they mean. This is not going to fly. They mean somewhere else. So, and the other thing to think about, we've talked about copyright quite a bit, is if you share your work in ResearchGate or in one of these other platforms, you have to have copyright permission to do that. You have to be able to legally do that. Because if you share a version of your work that you are not allowed to, what'll probably happen is that ResearchGate will get a takedown notice from your publisher. Academic publishers, very serious about intellectual property. So you wouldn't want that to happen. We want to abide, by the law. That doesn't mean you shouldn't use them. You certainly should consider using them. They can be very useful in connecting you to your peers, finding collaborators for your projects, sharing information about what you're working on, and engaging in academic discussions. They're fairly intuitive to use. If you can figure out one, you can figure out the other. They make uploading work very easy. They're identical, they're not similar. Next slide. So we'll talk a little bit about ResearchGate. Even if you haven't joined ResearchGate, it's likely that you've run across ResearchGate results in your Google results. So I know sometimes if I'm looking for an article and I don't see access through the library, I Google it, right, to see if I can get some kind of other access to it online. And often I come to a result high up in the results list, which is very good, from ResearchGate. And it says, when I open it, it either says, click here to request the article, in which case you're requesting it from the article's author, or it's just got the article, there in the product and the platform already. And that's great. So when you sign up for a ResearchGate account, you do that at researchgate.net. It's going to ask you what your research interests are. It's going to ask you which institution you're affiliated with, and based on those, it's going to suggest people that you might want to connect with on ResearchGate. You can follow them. They can follow you back. You get a news feed like you're kind of used to with other social media platforms. So what we have on the screen here is a news feed. And in the news feed, I see my colleague, Amy Freeman, and it's something that she wrote. This is from 2017. So the people who follow you will also get information about you in their news feed. So it's a nice way to see what your peers are doing and for your peers to see what you're doing. There's a questions tab up at the top. You might notice kind of above Amy's head there. And that's a place where you can ask questions of peers who are also in ResearchGate, or answer questions from peers who are also in ResearchGate. So it's another good way to interact with other people in your field. And just make yourself a recognizable name. Let everybody know that you're someone in this field, you know what you're talking about. Next slide. And if you decide to use ResearchGate as you interact with the platform and add articles and answer questions and collaborate, within the ResearchGate platform, you're going to get a scores section. So here at the top of the screen, we see something that says RG score. Obviously, that stands for ResearchGate score. This is some other colleague. She has a score of 8.97. So the thing to know about this score, it appears to be like a measure of your impact, right? But it's really, it's pretty meaningless outside of ResearchGate. So it's basically an algorithm that ranks your participation in ResearchGate. So for example, if you post research that lots of other people interact with, or if you have discussions with other high-profile users, your score goes up. Who cares? You know, probably nobody. It's not for your CV. It's not for your tenure and promotion materials. It's just kind of for you to know. So that's just something to keep in mind. There are other scores that you might receive on ResearchGate that are kind of similar. There's a ResearchGate interest score, for example, and it's kind of the same thing. It's based just on your use of ResearchGate. So down below it, you see an H-index. H-index is important for some of you, particularly those of you in the sciences. H-index is a flawed but rather important measure of researcher success and impact. A researcher's H-index is calculated by counting the number of publications for which an author has been cited by other authors at least that same number of times. So for example, if you have an H-index of 8, that means that the researcher has published at least 8 articles that have been cited at least 8 times. So H-index might be important for you based on your discipline. If it is, I do not think I would rely on the ResearchGate H-index. There are better places to find it. So one of the things I was going to show you today that I'm not going to be able to is finding an H-index using Web of Science. And we'll just talk about it a little bit, and then I'll send some instructions. Ask a librarian how to do it, find a tutorial online. That's probably going to be your best way to get an H-index. Next slide, please. And here's Academia.edu. Like I said, it's similar. If you can figure out one, you can figure out the other. Some researchers use both, some use one. It's up to you to decide. Either one of them can be pretty useful for forming connections. Next slide, please. So I mentioned LinkedIn. I lumped it in with this group of platforms because it's a place where you're probably going to interact with other people in your field. And I know most of us are probably kind of familiar with LinkedIn. There are some tips for using it as a researcher. So we've got some on the left side of the screen here. One is to build a robust profile. You can put your best self forward on LinkedIn by including all of your relevant articles, presentations, classes taught, you know, kind of like you would with your CV. Be a little bit judicious. If you have some small award from, you know, high school or undergrad, you know, maybe that's not worth listing there because you probably have a feel at this point for what other people in your discipline are going to find important and what they're not. Just like with ResearchGate or any of these other social media platforms, you can connect with other people on LinkedIn. You can get updates about those people. They can get updates about you again. So that's a good place to connect with other people, potential collaborators, potential employers in your field. You can also join professional groups within LinkedIn. You can ask questions and participate in conversations. That can, you know, just another way to make your name recognizable. Your LinkedIn headline, which if you look at this little picture that we've got, the little screen cap here, it's a profile for Stacy. It looks like her name is Conkiel. I'm a Stacy, she's a Stacy, we're different Stacys. This is just a picture that I kind of grabbed online. Down below her name, she's got a headline, and that can be, you know, when you're thinking about your wording for your headline, think carefully about the wording that you're going to be putting in there because it could be a little bit of an elevator pitch. And again, for any of these platforms, you might want to have a good headshot. So a good picture of yourself, not just, you know, you hanging on your couch. You've probably thought of this before. I'm not an expert at telling you what makes a good headshot, but There are a lot of resources online for taking a headshot that makes you look like a valuable professional member of your field. You can look at those, and the graduate school occasionally does headshots. So keep that in mind, and when they have one of these events, absolutely sign up, and if you need a headshot, get one taken. And finally, the reason that I included this little picture on the slide here is because one thing that you can consider based on your own comfort level is making your LinkedIn profile as visible as possible. So sometimes when I Google people, their LinkedIn profile comes up fairly high on the results list, but when I click on it, I don't really see any of their information. You do have some control over your privacy settings, which is what you see on the little picture here. So if you wish to make yourself more publicly visible on LinkedIn, you can check some boxes to make yourself as visible as possible. All right, next slide, please. And then once you've done some promotion of your work, you're kind of established, you've published some papers, you can monitor and track your impact. This is really important for some of you, right, when you go forward. If you work in academia, a lot of your tenure and promotion considerations are based upon your impact as a researcher. So traditional things that we might want to track are things like, impact factor, H-index, citation counts, number of publications. These are all important, particularly if you are in the sciences. Your H-index might be really important. I was going to show you how to do that in Web of Science, but instead I'll send some instructions. And another place that you can track your some of your bibliometrics is in Google Scholar. Next slide, please. And this Google Scholar slide kind of is killing two birds with one stone. So first of all, notice we've got, here's our friend Albert Einstein. He's got a Google Scholar profile. Notice on the right side of the screen, we see an H-index for him. We see his citation count, 86,302, according to Google Scholar. That's pretty good. I will say, if you ever look at citation counts in Google Scholar versus other more traditional places to find citation counts, such as Web of Science, you'll find that the Google Scholar citation count tends to be a little higher, kind of a little bit inflated. Sometimes Google Scholar counts things as citations that aren't real citations to actual academic articles. But anyway, it's still a good reference point. I don't know how it affects your H-index. So here we've got his metrics. You can make a Google Scholar profile for yourself, and it's really a nice thing to do. Of course, it's free. I'll send some instructions on how you do that. You could have a profile just like Albert Einstein has here. Notice that he's got a page with all of his, we just see a little screen cap of it, but we've got all of his articles. We've got information about his metrics, his impact. He hasn't shared his email address, but if he had, it would make it really easy to contact him. You could, if you wanted to collaborate, for example, with Albert Einstein. So if you made one of these for yourself, if somebody Googled you within Google Scholar, and I love Google Scholar, even as a very, very experienced librarian, I like to go to Google Scholar as a place to discover articles. I do it all the time. So if you've got a Google Scholar account, or a Google Scholar profile, that profile is going to appear high in the results page if somebody Googles your name on Google Scholar. And when they open it, they're going to see the same thing. They're going to see a list of what you've published, which is nice. It gets everything in the same place. They're going to, if you've included your email, they'll see your email. So if they want to contact you, they certainly can. Okay, next slide, please. So we're about there. Some takeaways from today. Consider your presence, consider your options before you publish. We talked about that quite a bit earlier. It's becoming a situation where sharing and promotion of your work are essential parts of the research process. All researchers need to be doing it to some extent. You can't expect your department to do it for you. I learned yesterday, if you're in the humanities, you probably can't expect your book publisher to do it for you, for example. So a lot of this will probably be up to you. And luckily, there are a lot of tools that can help you monitor your impact. And again, there are librarians who are very happy to help you. If you visit the library website, you'll find that we're all working from home. So even during this strange time, if you need help, contact a librarian and we can absolutely work with you. We can just do a consultation from home. We can send you whatever you need. Okay, let's open it up to questions. If you'll put it on the next slide, it's got my email address. So if you are interested in contacting me for any reason, please feel free. Again, there's a lot of librarians, so visit the library website. Are there any questions for me?
Great, thank you, Stacy. And I'm going to come back to this slide in just a moment. First, I'm going to run through a few announcements as you're thinking of your questions. So our graduate professional development programming for the spring has really taken a hit because of the coronavirus public health pandemic that we're facing, and our university has been responsive in trying to take important precautionary measures to protect the health and safety of all of us, our students, our faculty, and staff. The latest information is always available on the coronavirus homepage at go.sc.edu/coronavirus. Next week, April 6th through 10th, is Graduate Student Appreciation Week. This is a nationally recognized week when we celebrate our graduate students. We have nearly 6,000 graduate students at the University of South Carolina, Columbia campus. Unfortunately, as a result of the precautionary measures, we're unable to host the usual events and activities for that week. So we have a couple of virtual offerings for you in celebration of Graduate Student Appreciation Week. We have a virtual chat with Dean Cheryl Addy on Monday from 3 to 5 p.m. This is an informal drop-in chat where you can just join us for a few minutes and ask us a few questions, let us know how you're doing, and the dean will be there to respond. The URL to join the chat is available on the image. We also are going to be featuring a virtual webinar on preparing a better poster. So this is a type of poster format that has come to the scene of professional organizations, conferences, and meetings. And it's a new format that re-envisions how we share our information in this printed format. And so we are going to offer a bit of an overview of how you can use the better poster format, including featuring the real firsthand experiences of 2 of our current doctoral candidates, both of whom happen to be in public health. So that is Tuesday, April 7th from 3 to 4 p.m. and you could register using the link available. You can also find us online every Friday during the fall and spring semesters of the academic year. Today, we're actively pushing out virtual resources for professional development. As you're using the time as best you can, nobody's calendar became virtual overnight. We did want to be able to offer you connections to previous resources that we've shared, current resources, and new resources that are coming online. And in fact, university libraries has put a number of their other trainings and webinars online for you to be able to access. You can take advantage of the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity resources as a graduate student. The instructions to join are provided here on the slide. And also, the National Postdoctoral Association has resources for graduate students. So with both the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity and the National Postdoctoral Association, you can take advantage of those available resources as graduate students. Just a reminder that the handouts for today's webinar do include a PDF of the webinar slides. And when Stacy sends me the additional links, I will email out those links and a PDF to everybody who is registered. And so if you're viewing the recorded version, you will need to initiate an email to gradprofdev@sc.edu to request a copy of the materials from today. All right, let's get to the questions. So the first question is, are preprints the same as unpublished manuscripts? Stacy, you're on mute. If you could just unmute. There you go. Okay, I just unmuted you. I think
took a little while.
Sorry
about that. So generally speaking, the definition for preprint is the version of an article before it undergoes peer review. I don't know if that ever varies by discipline. It's possible that it does, but when I think preprint, that's generally what I'm thinking. And then post-print is generally post peer review, but before formatting changes have been made by the publisher.
All right, our next question is, Stacy, can you talk a little bit more about repositories? What are they and what are their strengths and weaknesses?
So it's a big question because there are many different types of repositories. So a repository is generally run by a library or an agency. A repository is a place to archive the outputs of scholarly research. It could be journal articles or other kinds of publications. It could be research data. It's a place, a repository is an archive for scholarly outputs that has a long-term plan for preservation. So it's a place where you would expect to be able to store your information long-term, and generally speaking, repositories are open to some group of people or to everyone. So an open access repository would be an online archive where anyone could go to access the scholarly information. So for example, Scholar Commons is the institutional repository at the University of South Carolina. And in the repository, we have electronic theses and dissertations by students at the university. There are, as allowed by copyright, there are all kinds of versions of faculty publications. When I do a conference talk or a conference poster, I put a version, I put my, my slides or my conference poster file in the repository. Other people from all around the world can find it and download it. It is licensed with a Creative Commons license that says, hey, you can use this. You can make changes to it if you want to. If you can reuse it for your purposes, please give me credit so that I get a citation if they use it. There are all kinds of licenses that are used within repositories. License meaning what other people are allowed to do with your content. But it's a place to store scholarly outputs of all kinds.
Thank you. Does your CV have to include every time you do a presentation? So if you speak on a topic and not a paper, does that need to go on it?
I'm probably not the best person to answer that question. I think it varies. I'll say that by discipline. Maybe there is somebody, perhaps Dr. Brandt would even be a better person to answer this than I would. I know how my CV appears as a librarian. And that's probably something different than you know, an engineer would do.
Sure. So this does vary by discipline. It's a great question to ask your mentors or to look online at CVs of mentors or other people in your field. In my field of public health, absolutely all presentations go on your CV. Now, the type of presentation is going to determine how you present it. So, for example, if you are submitting in response to calls for abstracts for professional or scientific meetings, and there will be a dimension of peer review, that's much different than if you are invited to give a presentation is much different from giving a presentation to a community group. These are all valued and important ways of disseminating your scholarship and extending your knowledge, but these get listed differently throughout the CV. And so you should create subheadings for professional and scientific conference presentations, and even indicating which ones were peer-reviewed and which ones were not. You also would include if it was a poster, oral, roundtable, or some other type of presentation to indicate what type you gave. The same is true for invited presentations, which will happen as you become more established, or perhaps you're conducting your research and scholarship in a very innovative area where there's a lot of demand for your expertise. So in all cases, yes, formal presentations that are given to audiences go on your CV. Other types of presentations would include guest lectures. So if you are guest lecturing in a formal classroom setting, that also would be another type of presentation that you would list out and include. Do you recommend, I can't wait to hear how you answer this question. I'll add in, thank you. Good question. All these questions are great, but this one in particular, I love to hear how people respond. Do you recommend separating personal and academic social media accounts?
Yeah, that is up to you. I see a lot of people, particularly the younger people, they seem very comfortable with mixing the two. It depends on the kind of person that you are. I'd say it depends on what your social media account includes. I think that sprinkling a little bit of your personality into your professional social media could not be anything but good. You know, that seems like a good idea to give them a little idea of who you are as a person. I wouldn't be comfortable mixing the two together. Part of that might be a little bit my age. Part of it might have to do with different experiences that I've had in my life. But it's definitely your call.
All right, thank you. So I have been personally doing a lot of research on this because I've established my Twitter account and handle and what I tweet about professionally over the last 11 plus years. And I also have mixed in my personal love for sports, for example, and for various pop culture references because it's who I am and I stand by what I put out there. But recently, I've been strongly encouraged to consider kind of separating that and creating a more personal and a more professional account. So it's been a struggle for me because I am who I am. And what I think right now about what's happening in leadership and decision-making related to this public health crisis is just as much my professional opinion as it is my personal opinion. So I don't find that it's a very clean line for me. And so I am struggling, but I am currently working through this process. I have been tweeting lots of things about the current global health pandemic using my professional account because it is a public health issue, but I've also been including a lot of sort of personal thoughts is part of that. But I'm working through it. There are colleagues of mine at the University of South Carolina and beyond who have set up their professional and personal Twitter handles in such a way that that's how they did it. And so it's much cleaner for them to keep those things separate. So for me, it's been a little bit more challenging because for 11 years I've tweeted using the same handle. And I've always had kind of a personal handle on the back burner, but have not used it to the same extent. So I do think it's a very personal decision. If I were up and coming on the job market, I would absolutely separate them. I would lock down my personal account. I would focus my professional account very much on my research, scholarship, and other related activities in order to put that professional persona out there. But as you become more experienced in your career, I think the decision is much more challenging.
And I guess it might be a good time to just, not that y'all have never considered this, but to think about what is on your Facebook, you know, from 7 or 8 years ago, you know, so particularly if you're thinking of combining the two, you know,
and this is not indicative of everyone's behavior, but I always say you've got to take those beer pong pictures down from your Facebook account from back when you were maybe in undergrad or something. We always say there's something. That's just my go-to. I know that doesn't apply to everyone, but it does when you go on the job market. And not to get too far afield here, we do need to wrap things up, but it is important to take a look at your social media because it is part of your digital footprint. Google yourself. I remember, Stacy, at the beginning of the presentation, you said Google yourself. Don't just Google yourself from your own device. Ask your friend to Google you from his or her, their devices, to see what comes up, because yours will look different than somebody else's. And so inventory those and find out how you can make sure that you have your best foot forward out there professionally, because we of course want you to be able to find a meaningful career path for you, whatever that looks like, and to not have that be hampered by some of the ways in which we have opened ourselves to be more accessible and create our research presence online. Well, we are over time. Thanks y'all for hanging in there. We've had a great discussion. These are great questions. Of course, you can contact Stacy at any time. And if you need anything related to this webinar or otherwise regarding professional development, please be sure to email us at gradprofdev@sc.edu. You can access a lot of our resources online, and we hope that you're adjusting well to this new reality that we're living in. And please do feel free to let us know if you have any questions. It takes about a few hours for the webinar to process before we can make the recorded version available. And again, I wish you all the best and hope to see you on the virtual chat next week. Thank you, Stacy. This was another wonderful webinar, and everyone have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.